Hey, what's going on? It's Dr. Mike T. Nelson here with the Flex Diet Podcast. Back once again. And today, if you are super nerdy into nutrition, supplements, and even some exercise, a little bit of health, and especially performance and body comp, I have a treat for you. As I was at the International Society of Sports Nutrition Conference just recently, June 10th through the 12th in St. Petersburg, Florida. And I'm going to do a breakdown of many of the talks I think that you will find interesting. I won't be able to get to all of them. And yeah, I think it'll be a good time, especially if you want the most cutting edge information. A lot of what was presented hasn't even been officially published in any literature yet. That's the beauty of going to in-person conferences, which are going again now, which is awesome, is that you can get some brand new data that hasn't really seen the light of day with the exception of a presentation at a conference. So as always, this is brought to you by the Flex Diet Podcast. Go to flexdiet.com if you want the latest on how to set up 8 different interventions for better body composition and performance, all while increasing your health at the same time. Go to flexdiet.com, flexdiet.com. Get onto the wait list there, and we will notify you the next time that it opens. As of now, looks like it's going to be mid-July will be the next time that it opens. So go to flexdiet.com. That'll also put you on the wait list there when you go to getting on the wait list. That'll also put you on the newsletter. You'll get all sorts of great information. If you enjoyed today's podcast, definitely get on to the newsletter. So as I mentioned, this will be a recap of the ISSN meeting. And it was amazing. It was super fun. It was great. I went down with Dr. Lonnie Lowry and some of his students. I helped them a little bit with a poster. The students did really good. All the credit really goes to them for the work that they put in. To Dr. Lonnie Lowry, we can also hear us and Coach Phil Stevens on Iron Radio. Did a great job once again mentoring undergrad students on how to do research. It's very common and a part of a master's program in most disciplines that you will need to publish your own research. Obviously, if you're doing a PhD, that's the whole point of the degree, is how to publish and conduct studies. But at an undergrad level, it's actually very rare. And it's even more rare to have students publish something alongside master's, PhD, and even PhDs at the same time. So we help them do a study on caffeine and coffee related to heart rate variability, which was awesome. The short kind of oversimplified takeaway is that Starbucks Via packets, which are more standardized for caffeine content, actually result in a little bit more parasympathetic tone as measured by heart rate variability. So parasympathetic tone is a little bit more rest and relaxation. Now again, that's a little bit of an overview. I'll have a picture of the poster somewhere around here. I'll try to stick it into the notes so you can read everything there. So shout out to the students who did a great job on that. So if we dive into some of the meeting here, the official notes are not yet quite up for members of the ISSN. In the future, they will have them on the ISSN website, so you'll be able to see everything. But I wanted to get this podcast out to you as soon as possible, so you have all the latest and greatest data. So this is from my personal notes. I tried to get as many details as I could, but due to the interest of time and just my ability to write everything down, it's going to be partial. So if you do have questions, you can send a note to me. I'll do my best to track them down and get an answer to you, but I won't be able to have every single detail for the studies. even if I did, that would probably be incredibly boring to listen to. So I want to get to you the highlights, and if you have questions, I will do whatever I can to get you the information. And also, as a shameless plug, I am a member of the International Society of Sports Nutrition. I did the ISSN certification through them. They have the 19th annual conference. Will be at the Expo in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, June 16th through the 18th, 2022. So if you enjoy sports science, I would highly recommend that you check it out. If you enjoy more of the neurosports angle, you can check for another podcast I did here from the Neurosports Conference that I attended, and that was, I'll find a way of linking it here, but you can look up the Society of Neurosports. Their third annual conference will be January 21st through the 22nd, 2022. That'll be in Hollywood, Florida. So if you're looking for more of the neurosport and neuro exercise component, definitely check that one out. I'm trying to, hopefully I'll be there. And then if you're into more of the nutrition and sports supplement angle, check out the ISSN 19th Annual Conference, Fort Lauderdale, Florida, June 16th through the 18th, 2022. So a huge thank you to all the members of the ISSN this year for all the work that they did. Really appreciate it. Shout out to Eric Bustiello, who always does a great job running around, making sure everything is on track. Dr. Chad Kirksey was helpful with the organization of the conference and the speakers, and then also the current president, Dr. Tricia Van Dusseldorp, for all of her work putting it together. It's a massive undertaking trying to herd that many cats to get it together. So huge thanks to them and Dr. Jose Antonio, everyone at the ISSN, all the board members for making this possible. So the meeting started off on a Thursday, and unfortunately I was not able to get there until a little bit later. I had the launch of the physiologic flexibility cert going on. I had some client stuff and some other deadlines for projects. I got down to Florida on Wednesday night and literally just went to bed. Not too far along after I got there, and then got up super early at 5:15 in the morning, did my little morning routine meditation, and was working to try to get as much stuff done as I could before the conference. I did take a break to go to exercise at the Lifetime Fitness down there in Tampa, which was awesome. And then was stuck at the Chipotle near the conference trying to get some last minute stuff done. So unfortunately, due to that, I did miss a few of the presentations that started it off on Thursday. Eric did one on registered dietitians, top pieces of advice for RDs and sports nutritionists, which I heard was great. There was a talk on nutrient timing, which goes beyond just looking at macros, by Patrick Hardy. Andrew Yegerman did a presentation on energy status of collegiate athletes, and the literature on that usually shows that a lot of college athletes are way under eating. And then Dr. Guillermo Escalante did a great talk on the diet refeeds and diet breaks. I did get to chat with him a fair amount at one of the president's dinners on Saturday night, or it was Friday night. All the days run together. Friday night that I was invited to with Dr. Lonnie Lowry and about 12 other people. Great guy. I'm going to try to get him on the podcast. He will be on Iron Radio coming up here to talk about kind of the life of a professional bodybuilder. It's kind of what we're looking at right now. But great information on that. I did get to talk to him about it. The short takeaway is the research right now is pretty darn split. If I were to hedge a bet, I would say that diet breaks may not be as physiologically impactful as what we once believed, but I do think there is a role for them, even if it's more on the psychology side. Again, this is based on very limited data, but hopefully we'll have more on that in the future. We do have a little bit in here coming up, talk that Dr. Bill Campbell gave, so stay tuned for more information on that. Dr. Ralph Yeager gave a great talk on gut health. How are athletes different, and what role can probiotics play in performance and recovery? Unfortunately, I got there just towards the tail end, but I did get a chance to talk to Ralph, who always has really just super great information. I've known him through the ISSN for, probably over like a decade now. And one of the things he presented was perhaps we can look at probiotics in terms of increasing the amount of digested proteins. If we could give maybe a probiotic that increases maybe essential amino acid availability, that might be more anabolic for athletes. And it does look like there may be some data, hint, hint, in that area. The data was very preliminary, but super interesting. We don't know, does that translate into longer term effects? But if it does, then maybe you will start seeing probiotics in all sorts of protein supplements. If I were to hazard another guess, that would be my guess going forward. Very interesting talk by Dr. Omar Ekdar. Hopefully I've pronounced your name correctly there. Viewing sports performance through the lens of evolutionary biology, winner and loser effects, and why runners get high. This was very interesting. He gave a similar talk at the Neurosports conference. The takeaway from this is that there is a short-term effect in different animals, and it looks like possibly in humans too, on the winner effect. So they've done studies on, I think it was fighting fish and even fighting insects. And if the insect, they have like these little battles that they have them do, had lost and goes into another fight, it appears that the competitor goes after them right away. And if the insect or the little creature had won more, they seem to be a little bit more tentative, which I thought was super interesting. Now, how they can figure that out, or how do they know? Are they looking at some body posture or position? I have no idea, but very interesting. So he was looking at some related information in professional athletes. They didn't really see a huge effect, but again, these are professional athletes, so you would imagine that part of your job as a professional athlete is to make sure you can sort of buffer against that effect. They did some studies looking at doubleheaders in college baseball. And if I remember right and my notes are correct, it looks like there may be an effect there, but the effect was also very short term. Did not appear to last into the next day. So super interesting stuff. So look for more. Probably in the lay media, it'll be probably overblown about the winner effect. So the next day, we kicked it off with Dr. Grant Tinsley. Did an awesome talk on body composition assessment, and lack of standardization can wreak havoc. So you've probably heard me drone on a little bit in the past about the use of DEXA for body comp, and how a lot of studies that I've even peer reviewed haven't really standardized the protocol before having athletes do a DEXA or between tests. So just for some background, so DEXA is dual X-ray absorptivity. It was initially designed for body composition, not necessarily, but for bone mineral density. So most of the time you hear it now, at least in the sports world, is talking about body comp. The original machines were more designed for bone mineral density and have been adapted to body composition. Dr. Jordan Moon gave a great talk many years ago at the ISSN that went into all the details of the pros and cons of this. But DEXA, for the most part, is considered kind of I'm putting my air quotes here, gold standard for body composition. Reason for this is it does appear to be quite accurate. Now, again, when we say quite accurate, that does not mean if you are a legit 16.1%, that when you get an DEXA, it's going to automatically read 16.1%. There is some variability even when you are standardize everything the best that you can, just by the nature of the measurement. There is probably even more error comparing one DEXA to the next. I actually tried to find literature on that, and I can't really find much at all. So if you had a DEXA scan a year ago on a different model from a different location, and you have one a year later, there may be a fair amount of variability between that, because it's not only potentially different standardization, and even if you did standardize what you did beforehand, it's a different machine, it's different software, potentially different operators, though that's probably not as big of an issue. So don't really freak out if that is you and you see these massive differences. Try to have a follow-up measurement with the same machine, if at all possible. If not, look at other metrics such as change in body weight, pictures, performance, etc. So Grant had some really great data that they did a new study looking at a 4-component body measure. So this is trying to take the best subcomponents of looking at body comp and put them together in a comprehensive model, which they have published data showing that it is quite good. And when they were looking at this, they wanted to kind of sort of compare the standardization before or between measures make a difference. So you can imagine if you have a pre and a post condition, you could compare standardized to standardized. You could have your pre-assessment be not standardized, but your post-standardized, or you could flip-flop that, or you could just be completely unstandardized across the board. Now, you may be wondering, why you would not do some type of standardization. The reason is it's just convenience. So if you are trying to DEXA, let's say, a whole college football team, it's going to be harder and a lot more time and effort and staff, etc., to have everything be standardized, especially if you're just trying to get into the ballpark. So normally with standardization, we're looking at macronutrients because you have an association between body fat and lean body mass. There's a bunch of different words that are kind of thrown around. Muscle mass is not necessarily the same as lean body mass, but I will confess that I have kind of used those similarly. And we also have, probably more accurately, what's called fat-free mass. So most of the time, if you do what's called a 2-compartment model, you have your fat mass and then your fat-free mass. So your fat-free mass is literally everything that is not fat. So you can imagine if you have different amounts of carbohydrates, you're going to have different amounts of muscle glycogen, and that can kind of skew some of your readings. Fluid intake may affect some of it. If you drink let's say a bunch of water, that is body weight, but it's not necessarily fat mass. So that would count towards, in general, fat-free mass, but it's not really fat-free mass. It's a temporary thing. So that's why standardization is needed. What they did was they used, also compared different measurements across different systems. They used an in-body, they used DEXA, they used BOD-POD also. So if we take all of this together, I'll just give you some of the high points here. If they did not standardize the post, they saw an increase of about 1.4 kg of fat-free mass. Now the tricky part here is comparing, is this real versus not? But if we compare that to the unstandardized pre and post, they saw about a 4 kilogram difference. So there is some differences. Do you standardize or do you not standardize? The big grand takeaway, though, was standardization did not have nearly as big effect as what the researchers thought that it would. I can't remember, I didn't have a note here on the exact stats of what the difference was. Again, they will publish all of this data. But that was kind of surprising to me. I know I've been probably maybe unfairly in retrospect critical of DEXA. So we have some new data to show that maybe it's not as critical to be standardized as we thought. Now, again, if you are an individual and you are looking at small changes, right? Because even adding lean body mass or fat-free mass, that's a very long-term process. And if you are plus or minus 1 or 2 pounds, to you as an individual, that's kind of a big deal. So I do think as an individual, standardization is still the best way to go. Do the same macronutrients the day before. Do not train the day before. And then ideally have the measurement done in the morning. And they'll do what's called a dry fast overnight. So once you go to bed, do not consume any fluids until after you've had the DEXA scan. In a perfect world, it would be the same scanner, same time, same software, same location. So you're trying to minimize as many differences there as you can. However, if you're in charge of, let's say, the college football team, and you have a choice between Bod Pod or maybe a cheaper form of BIA or DEXA, DEXA is probably going to be your best bet and does not appear to be as affected by unstandardization as we thought. What was also cool, and I hope they publish a little bit more data on this too, is that the group that they took was a group of 19 subjects, and for 6 weeks they trained 3 days per week, and they actually put them on a hypercaloric diet with the goal of gaining 1 pound per week, and they averaged around 3,800 kilocalories per day. So this will be, I think, an interesting study to look at just what were some of the changes that they saw because of those parameters using their 4-component model, both pre and post. Again, it was a relatively short period. It was 6 weeks. But I think that data, once it comes out, will be super interesting. So there's some things you can do for body comp and good practice for DEXA. Another interesting one was by Brandon Roberts. Effects of Nsaids on muscle and bone from cell to soldiers. So he was looking at this as part of some Army research. Again, he was at the dinner on Friday night, so I got to talk to him a fair amount. I got to sit next to him. A really great guy, super interesting study. When they were looking at the use of NSAIDs, so common NSAIDs are going to be like Advil, naproxen. These have an analgesic, so a pain-killing effect. And there's some interesting data that they may change rates of muscle hypertrophy. The data is relatively, I'd say, kind of split. In animal studies, it's pretty conclusive, but we're not all the same physiology as rats. And some of the data shows that high use of NSAIDs may blunt some of the muscle hypertrophy effects in humans. If you contrast that to the real world, though, you do find some very large mammals who have used high amounts of NSAIDs, and it doesn't really appear anecdotally to affect them. If you look also at older populations, you can look up some of Dr. Trappy's work. They've published showing that NSAIDs in an older population may actually be mildly anabolic, meaning they might be helpful. The theories on this is potentially differences in inflammation in younger people versus older people. But Brandon Roberts was citing some internal data they had in terms of prescriptions for use of NSAIDs in the military. The active Army populations that they looked at was around 82% compared to only about 12% in the general population. So they have a high amount of use. As you know, NSAIDs tend to block some of the COX enzymes. These are cyclooxygenase enzymes, especially the form 1 and 2. There are other forms of these drugs that can more selectively block either the COX-1 or the COX-2. So they were looking to see, was there any difference between those on possibly rates of healing. So in general, what they found was that standard Nsaids, at least on some of the preliminary data, cell culture, did not show huge different effects. Again, they're doing a much more acute human subject study that'll be coming out this fall, so they may have more information on that. They did find, however, that a particular form at high doses was more toxic to muscle cells. And I believe that was one that blocks the COX-1 enzyme specifically. Again, that's a drug that's not nearly as common. And if I remember correctly, it was an in vitro study. Yes, it was in a cell culture. And it was pretty high dose, but it was something that was still high enough you could see in humans. So more data to come out on that. I think the future will be looking at specifically COX-1 versus COX-2 drugs. Is one potentially more toxic to muscle than another? As a takeaway, he mentioned that there is some interesting data on tart cherry juice that may help soreness and inflammation and does not appear to affect changes in muscle hypertrophy. So as a short primer, remember that actually having some increased what's called ROS, reactive oxygen species, a little bit of local inflammation appears to be needed for the remodeling effects for hypertrophy and maybe even strength. So we don't want to blunt those effects completely. How much of an effect do we need is still kind of up for debate. So more interesting stuff coming out on that. Dr. Katie Hirsch did a great talk on high-intensity interval training and essential amino acid supplementation. So for this one, they used high-intensity interval training. They did 10 rounds for 1 minute at a 90% of their max. I believe they used a bike for this. And they've presented earlier data showing that high-intensity interval training can actually add lean body mass in untrained individuals. Dr. Martin Gabalia has published a lot of data on that. Again, that is in untrained individuals. They talked about Dr. Stu Phillips has shown that muscle protein synthesis in resistance exercise using HIIT that increases it for about 24 to 48 hours post. I don't remember if that was in untrained individuals or not. So if you do high intensity interval training, that is much closer to strength training than kind of standard cardiovascular aerobic training. So they looked at a study that was 66 people, average age 36 years old. They were a little bit more on the sedentary, overweight status, and they were investigating high-intensity interval training and essential amino acids. They did not see any RMR changes in terms of resting metabolic rate. They did see an increase in the high-intensity interval training in VO2 max, right? So the volume of oxygen you can run through your system. And that's supported by other data showing that in untrained people, high-intensity intervals do help with that. They did show a drop in RER. So this is a way on a metabolic cart that you can measure how much fat versus carbohydrate somebody is using. So if you see a lower RER, so respiratory exchange ratio, it's looking at the ratio between your oxygen and carbon dioxide. If that number is lower, usually closer to 0.7, that shows that your body is using more fat at rest. And that's what they saw here. They saw a drop in RER, which indicates at rest, your body is using more fat. However, in terms of body comp, they did not see any change in body fat. Again, I don't believe that they did anything with calories per se, though. No changes in fat-free mass. They did do DEXA of whole body, and they did see a little bit of change in the thigh in terms of lean body mass increase. Again, I believe they used biking or cycling with this. Yep, they did. So you would expect that maybe lower body may see an increase in lean body mass, but overall, probably would not expect to see much change in the arms. This was shown by an increase in the vastus muscle cross-sectional area at the end of 8 weeks. They did see whole body turnover rate of proteins were better with essential amino acids, which they said was better muscle quality. What exactly is muscle quality is a little bit debatable in the literature. And what was interesting about the intervention they did is they had the very last round of 10 they did to exhaustion. So they could look to see was there any type of performance changes too. The dose of essential amino acid was twice per day at 3.6 grams. This was given 30 minutes pre and 30 minutes post. And this was done for a total of 8 weeks. And if I'm checking my notes here to see if I have anything else on that study of what else they found. Yeah, so if I remember correctly, there wasn't a huge difference between the groups on that. But again, I would have to go back and double check. So yeah, so the changes in RMR, no changes, increase in VO2 max, the drop in RER, and no change in body fat was both for the group that just did the high intensity interval work and the group that high intensity interval training with essential amino acids. So you could argue that the inclusion of essential amino acids here did not have any effect. Again, the dosing on that is relatively low, so I would be kind of surprised if it did show an effect. You could argue maybe bumping up the dose would be beneficial, but it does kind of match my bias that the biggest thing is training quality. If you get a high enough quality stimulus, especially in untrained people, you're probably going to see some benefit. Now again, that doesn't mean nutrition can't be beneficial, but you're probably going to need to see changes in calories and potentially overall protein. The reason for using essential amino acids here is that they're trying to make something that's an intervention you can do that's reasonable for people who are also untrained. So if they did see that it moved the needle a lot, you could easily have someone consume essential amino acids pre and post training. They don't really upset your stomach. There's not a lot of volume. You can get by with putting them in a very small amount of fluid. So if it was positive, that would be pretty cool and something that may, again, move the needle quite a bit for people who are not necessarily trained and are still working on those habits. The easier you can make an intervention for people to do, more likely they are going to do it. All right, so I'm going to skip ahead a few talks here because I was kind of in and out for a lot of the other talks in between. Next one is by Dr. Gabriel Sanders, Workload and Neurologic Performance in D1 Anaerobic Athletes. Really interesting talk. He gave a talk at the Neurosports Conference also, and they've done some very interesting stuff by trying to monitor a lot of their performance in their team sports there. Everything from the polar heart rate system to the catapult system that measures acceleration, deceleration, GPS, just a whole host of parameters. My buddy, Dr. Ben Peterson, used to work for them for a while, so I've been able to talk with him in the past about it. Really fascinating system. And what they saw was ideally the athletes who had the best performance had a minimal changes over the season, especially in body weight. And I thought this was really fascinating. So something that's really simple, if you don't have money for team monitoring, get them a scale, have them step on the scale each day, and there's new systems that will allow you to almost import it directly. I use a software called Chronometer. So I have my online clients. I've been doing this with them specifically about 5 years. I found huge use of just daily body weight. The reason I went to daily body weight was if I did a measurement, say Sunday night, at the end of the day, it's going to be too variable. So I would want to do it in the morning. If their check-in was, say, Mondays, they may get on the scale Monday morning. But because of maybe some changes they made in their weekend, that single point may not be necessarily representative of where they were at. So I like them just to, use the bathroom in the morning, get on the scale, and just log it. So that way we're going to have a daily measurement that's going to be fairly accurate. Of course, it's not telling us body comp, but we can look at the trends over time, and it's going to be less volatile based on just a single measurement every 7 days. And what they showed here is that athletes over the course of a season, they had a greater VO2 max, and they also had minimal weight changes of body weight. So you can just plug in the data by hand into Chronometer. There's a bunch of other ways you could get it. And so remotely, you can do this with athletes, or if they come in every day, you could standardize it to when they come into the facility. Either way, I thought that was very interesting. Something that does not take a lot of technology, I think is dramatically underused as a monitoring strategy. We did ask them about, did they use heart rate variability? They did not, just because they had to draw the line somewhere with all the technology they were using. And the last part here is that for nutrition education in terms of an intervention to do with athletes, he said the best thing that they did was literally take them grocery shopping, which doesn't, again, cost you very much money or no money at all, and just educate them about, the difference in nutrition and fueling. He said that made a profound difference. They did it as a team. So again, my takeaways with that is, yeah, there's some very interesting stuff they presented with workload and nutrition and neurology changes, and there's definitely a place for that. I think it's super useful. But for two things that don't require really or very minimal technology, again, that can have an effect, especially on team sports, body weight daily, and taking your team to the grocery store to educate them about nutrition. So if you've ever worked with college athletes, or even very high-level college athletes, or even some professional athletes, the data I've seen just on a personal level for those athletes that I've worked with in those settings, sometimes it's really good. A couple, let's say higher-end MLB and NHL players that I've worked with, really, really good. A few absolutely, utterly horrible. The first time I saw some nutrition from two very high-end, probably one of the top, easily within the top 5 female track athletes at the time in college, I thought the coach was playing some joke on me. It was a lot of fast food. They were dramatically under-eating, and turns out it wasn't a joke. That's actually what they were doing, and they were still running very fast. So don't assume that just because they are a high-level athlete that their nutrition is on point. Many, many times it is not. Again, education going to be the first place to start with that. So next up we had a good buddy, Dr. Bill Campbell. Rapid fat loss, how fast is too fast? This is with one of his graduate students, Alexander Brooks. And we all know that the issue is if you lose fat or weight too fast, you can definitely lose muscle. I've published stuff in, it's a book from CRC Press, Dietary Protein and Resistance Exercise, and I reviewed some of the studies showing that especially if you have a low protein intake, that you are going to lose lean body mass. If you are heavy weight training, you may lose less. I think that's a little bit debatable. But if you slash your calories by 40 to 60% overnight, you stay around the RDA of protein, which is around 60 grams total per day, which is very low for athletes. And you do that, you potentially are going to lose lean body mass. All the studies so far would say yes. Now, if you add strength training to that, I think you may be able to keep some of that muscle, but you're definitely not doing yourself any favors. So what they did was a 6-week study. They had 2 weeks before. They had kind of like a maintenance phase. They did 2 weeks of an aggressive diet, and then they had 2 weeks of them just walking around kind of free living. Again, very short study, but again, super interesting to see. They did not make any changes to their training. These were people 18 to 49 years old. They had been resistance training greater than 6 months, although he said most of them had been doing it quite longer than that. They've been doing a minimum of 2 sessions per week. 6 weeks, they met with someone who monitored their training. So they had assigned to them online an in-person guide or coach. They also had a nutrition coach. So they had to do daily check-ins. So they did everything they possibly could to ensure compliance and to get the most accurate data that they could, which I think is really good because self-report data is kind of a big downside to a lot of those studies. They had 2 groups, the linear group, which for that 2-week period, they just cut their calories by 37% every day. They had the non-linear group, where week 1, they slashed their calories by 50%, and then week 2, only by 25%. And both groups lost, or I should say both groups had a reduction in the same amount of calories. They just had the linear group, which was 37% reduction over those 2 weeks. And then the non-linear group, where week 1, they cut them by 50%. Week 2, they cut it by 25%. They had them on a high protein diet, so about 1 gram per pound of body weight, using about 60% carbs and 40% fat was the rest of the diet. So post-diet, after that 2-week period, they were free living. So no instructions, just go about your daily life of what you're going to do. Pre-measure, they made sure they had no exercise for 24 hours. They did a dry fast overnight. They measured RMR, right? So resting metabolic rate and body fat. What they found with the results was that adherence was really good. Actually, it was very, very good. Body comp, they lost about 3 pounds during the 2-week phase. What was interesting is after the 2 weeks where they went back to their normal life, they were not given any other instructions, they kept about 50% of it off. Now that to me was surprising. I would have expected by the end of those 2 weeks that they would have been back to normal again, but that was not true. So some interesting data that maybe for short periods of time, maybe being a little bit more aggressive is okay. They lost about 1.2% body fat, again, and they kept this most of the time. His goal for back of the envelope calculation, he recommends if people are already relatively lean, losing about 1% body fat per month is good. So I thought that was another key takeaway. So they lost about 2.2 pounds of fat mass and kept it there for the most part. Now, again, this is talking about averages and where they were at. 2/3 of it was fat, and 1/3 was lean body mass. So at first blush, you're like, oh, wait a minute. They were losing fat. Most of them kept some of the fat off. But if 2/3 of what they lost was fat and 1/3 was lean body mass over just 2 weeks, that does not seem ideal, right? Because you are losing lean body mass. You are not going to gain that much lean body mass in 2 weeks. It's going to take you a while to add that back. However, when they adjusted for total body water, they used a Series 3 compartment model. They found that the dry fat-free mass loss was only about 0.1 kilogram. So in English, what this means from nerd speak is that they did lose some water loss, and the machines detected that as a loss of lean body mass. So it turns out once they made this correction for a loss of body water, the real quote-unquote dry fat-free mass loss was only about 0.1 kilogram. So really nothing to write home about. So they did not appear in this short-term study to lose much of any lean body mass. So I thought that was also super interesting. So in terms of RMR, resting metabolic rate, after the 2 weeks, it went down about 5.5%, which really not that much of a difference. I would argue that may just be even in the machines, even though they did everything they can to minimize those changes. However, after the 2 weeks of going back to normal, there was a trend, which means maybe it was still about 2.6% lower. Now, again, a trend means that it didn't reach statistical significance. So we don't know if we added more people to the study to increase the statistical power. Would that really stay or would it change? So again, some data that, yes, your resting RMR may drop a little bit, but to me that's not super surprising, and it's not anything I would be extremely worried about. Again, you don't really want to lose resting metabolic rate, but from other research and stuff that I've seen, I think it's more resistant to changes than what we believe. So again, big shout out to Dr. Bill Campbell and everyone on his staff there. Really, really fascinating stuff to look and see if you are a little bit more aggressive, does it make a difference in body composition? Now again, all the standard caveats apply. It's one study, it's of a short nature. We don't know what happens if you repeat this. We don't know what happens if you get more aggressive or if you go longer than 2 weeks. So he was very careful to point out that this does not mean that everyone should be doing crazy 2-week cutting phases. But again, in a worst case scenario, still some super interesting data. Next up was a talk from Dr. Mike Roberts, who I always enjoy talking to him. I got to talk to him on a poster session next to Dr. Lane Norton and some other guys for a while. And yeah, so it was super interesting. The great part about going to these meetings is you get to talk to the actual researchers themselves, which is wonderful. You get to ask them particular questions because it's all very much, when you get down to this level of being in the weeds, there are just differences, I think, that can be hard to appreciate with it. So shout out to him. Also, James Longstrom was there. They did a poster, which was, again, super interesting too. So Dr. Mike Roberts' talk was looking at muscle hypertrophy. The big takeaway here is I actually felt better after this talk, even though it was a lot of data saying, maybe we're not entirely sure what's happening with muscle hypertrophy. So I felt a little better that reading some of the research that I get really confused. He pointed out that the myofibrils, they have this really interesting lattice structure and that they're highly interconnected. They're not this nice, smooth, parallel picture that we always thought that they were. This is from some new data using 3D imaging. And there's also some new data looking at female versus male response, how that might be different. How the mitochondria line up around the muscle cells is even different than what we thought. Some interesting data there showing that resistance training, looking at changes in methylation, did result in more what's called demethylated mitochondria. This is a signal for an increase in biogenesis, so making more mitochondria. And if you think about it, this makes sense, right? Muscle needs to have ATP, needs to take oxygen and form ATP. So having changes in mitochondria with certain types of resistance training kind of makes sense. They talked about some rats where they did what's called a synergistic ablation in the little bottom part of the leg. They'll cut one of the muscles to overload the other muscle all of the time. And they saw some changes in some of the type 2 fibers only. And this gets into, is there data on what's called the myonuclear domain theory, that you need a nucleus and it can only sort of govern a set amount of space. Some of the data previous says that yes, that is true. So to get more muscle, at some point you need to add more of these myonuclei. Some of the newer data now says maybe not so much. So maybe that's potentially changing. Very interesting data on looking at the microtubules that run through the muscle cellular structure itself. Things related to what's called extracellular matrix, which he said is probably going to be the next frontier looking at muscle hypertrophy. So we've probably been a little bit too over-focused on the actual sort of actin and myosin and the fibers themselves, but looking at what are all the other components that go into the muscle itself. Luc Van Loon's lab has been looking at capillarization related to that. And if you have more capillaries in the muscle, you can get more muscle itself. That kind of fits with what I've noticed in people who have a low VO2 max, that they can't necessarily have, or should say, have a harder time adding more muscle. I think that may be related to getting energy into the system at an appropriate rate. He also talked about myofibril splitting after very heavy work. This was what they saw on EM. And again, I think that might have been Dr. Darren who was talking about that. But really interesting talk. Again, I got to talk to him for quite a while. And yeah, the takeaway is, yep, in terms of things we know that drive muscle hypertrophy, lift heavy, more calories, more protein, more volume. Outside of that, what is actually going on, I think is probably still up for debate. What I would add to it is testing your VO2 max, making sure you're at least in the 50 to 75% of the population data. Again, not necessarily people who are lifting, but I think if you're in that higher part compared to general population, just anecdotally, I find that people's response is quite a bit better. Again, there's not a lot of direct literature to support that, but it makes sense that you need to convert ATP to get energy. And if that is occurring at a lower rate, maybe that is potentially a rate limiter. And next up, we had Dr. Matthew Stratton. Is the clock your greatest ally? An evaluation of current intermittent fasting literature. So he did a really great review on just the explosion in the research on intermittent fasting. So the terms, even intermittent fasting, there's all sorts of different terms. We can look at feeding versus fasting windows. And that's the generalization of how I think viewing intermittent fasting is going to be best. Now, keep in mind that, and he pointed this out quite a bit, that what you eat during the fasting window by vast majority of studies is not specified. So I think that will probably change in future research. There's also different types of fasting. I go over all of this in the shameless plug for the Flex Diet certification. I personally am a fan of fasting, but done in very controlled and specific ways for certain populations. There's also alternate day fasting. There's periodic fasting, which is 1 to 2 times a week. There's time restricted feeding, which is now probably being changed to time restricted eating, or TRE. There is some early data showing intermittent fasting, better glucose utilization, and that there may be some fat mass lost on average 8 to 12 weeks, losing about 3 to 5 kilograms that can be lost. Again, usually with that, you're going to see around a 20% reduction in total calories lost with intermittent fasting. Now again, that gets super messy because there's all different types of intermittent fasting. He did a really nice review of some of the studies. One of them was Morrow et al., 2016. They did a 16-8 approach to fasting. They had 34 people in the studies. They had done 5 years of resistance training. They attempted to be isocaloric with higher protein. And at the end, they did gain some fat-free mass in some of the people. The fat mass and the time-restricted feeding, they did lose fat mass. And then what's interesting is that they tried to keep them isocaloric. So again, this study wasn't necessarily looking at body composition changes, but he pointed out that despite them trying to keep them isocaloric, the time-restricted feeding, which again was a 16-8 approach, 16 hours of fasting with an 8-hour eating window each day, that the time-restricted fasting or eating, they did lose some body fat. Another one was Tinsley, which you may notice as Grant Tinsley, 2016 et al. There was 24 people, greater than 1 year of resistance training. What was interesting is this was actually all females. Again, they did a TRF approach of a 16-8, and they had high protein. So the goal was actually body recomp, not necessarily weight loss. They attempted to do this by a reduction of 250 kcals per day. And they did use a self-report on diet records. What they found was that fat mass in the time-restricted feeding window, that they did lose fat mass. Another study, this was from Stratton, so the presenter, 32 males, greater than 6 months resistance training, 16-8 versus a control group. Both got a 25% reduction in calories. Again, the goal here was fat loss. But they did not see any difference in fat mass, fat-free mass, or body fat percentage. Now keep in mind, I believe in this study, both groups saw a 25% reduction in calories. So some data to show that if you can control calories, once again, we don't see dramatic differences. So hold on to that theme. Another one was Tinsley, 2017, time-restricted feeding. They were, training, I think 4 days per week or 3 days of resistance training. And the TRF group ate 650 kcals per day less. And flipping through my notes here to make sure. And then they compared that to a normal diet. So TRF, they saw less but no significant changes. But there was a trend for an increase in fat-free mass on the normal diet and a decrease in fat mass for the time-restricted feeding. Again, no difference in performance in any of those groups. So my kind of biased takeaway from this is that I think there is a role for time-restricted feeding. It appears that if you control calories, you're probably not going to see a huge difference. Now again, these studies that were quoted here were all resistance training, generally very healthy individuals. Anecdotally, I have had people do a 16-8. They usually came to me doing that first, and they've been pretty good. They've been happy with their results. My bias is if someone comes in, I generally don't do a lot of the 16-8. Although if someone is very busy, their schedule is just kind of a nightmare, then I think it is a possibility. As in the Flex Diet Cert, I generally like, if people use a fasting approach, to slowly work up to 1 day of 19 to 24 hours and do a fast. But again, super interesting data. It was nice to see an outline of some of the work that has been done, especially the inclusion of resistance training. So a lot of fasting studies do not employ any resistance type training in it. I think we will be seeing more of this in the future. Unfortunately, I know there's some other data that due to COVID kind of got crushed in terms of a big trial looking at the 16-8 approach. I don't know if they'll be able to salvage any data from that. Again, that was not from this group, it was from a different group. But stay tuned for more information. I think fasting definitely can be an appropriate thing to use. It just depends upon what are your preferences and what do you like. I think if you're controlling calories, probably not going to see a significant difference, but maybe we'll find some other markers in health will change. And I do think that's going to be different if you're looking at a healthy resistance training population versus the general population. Next up was Dr. David Church talking about essential amino acids and protein synthesis. Really, really good stuff. The short version here is that essential amino acids will show up in the bloodstream and the plasma much faster than even whey protein. This begs the question, do they stimulate what's called MPS, muscle protein synthetic response? They do. And does the speed of how they show up matter? That probably, we're not sure. I would say maybe, but not sure. The other part is that these are all done generally as an overnight fast because they need to, because of the tracer and the stabilized approach that they use, they need to have kind of a steady state of the amino acid pool. So trying to do them in a fed state is very, very tricky. So again, this would be overnight in a fasted condition. He pointed out something which I think is overlooked, and I'm probably guilty of overlooking this myself, is that we tend to look only at muscle protein response, and we tend to poo-poo kind of whole body synthesis response. And the whole body synthesis response is important because if you have all these other greedy organs taking up your amino acids and you are not providing them via the diet, they are going to come from muscle, right? Because muscle is stored amino acids. So if whole body protein synthesis is good, then we can look to see where amino acids are coming from. So the takeaway there is we don't want muscle to be giving up amino acids to run different parts of the body. So I think, again, going back and zooming out and looking at the body as a whole organism and looking specifically at what happens in muscle is still important, but we need to keep in context what is going on with the entire body and the whole protein synthetic response with that. They did also, someone asked them a question then about if you are going to use essential amino acids, just taking more and more better. I know I've quoted some early work showing that 6 grams of essential amino acids was pretty effective. He said that from their lab, I think Arnie Fernandez has done some of this work too, that the max essential amino acid dose was around 15 grams. So when they went above that, they did not see a better acute response in muscle protein synthesis. Now again, these are all acute responses, which do give us some insight into what's going on with muscle tissue. Again, it does not necessarily scale linearly, meaning that if you took a dose of 6 grams of essential amino acids, are you going to get twice the amount of muscle growth with a 15-gram dose of essential amino acids? We have no idea to the answer to that question. I would say it's probably not going to be twice as good. Maybe a little better would be my pure guess. But again, we don't have much data on that. So my practical takeaway from this is I've used essential amino acids more recently with collagen in people training, especially doing some rehab, prehab, whatever work you want to associate with in the morning. Reason for that, especially if they don't like to eat until later, I know that I'm going to see an increase in plasma levels, and I know that that's going to translate acutely into adding more amino acids to muscle tissue. I don't know exactly how much muscle that will add, but there's not much of a downside other than cost. And then I will add 15 grams of collagen to that. Some work from Dr. Keith Barr, Dr. Shaw, showing that taken 40 to 60 minutes before exercise with a small amount of vitamin C may result in better soft tissue function. I've been doing that with athletes now probably about 2.5 years. Anecdotally, recovery and tissue healing appears to be better, but again, anecdotal, hard to say. Not much of a downside to that. So if there's some lift or something you're really trying to work on, or an area that you want to see a little more progress, maybe doing a couple sets of that in the morning, about an hour after essential amino acids and the collagen. Right now, I'm still using about 10 grams of essential amino acids, mostly just due to cost and being realistic, 15 grams of a hydrolyzed collagen. Next up, let's see, that was Dr. David Church. And this was interesting. This is from Brandon Willingham. Betaine supplement on fluid balance and thermoregulation in the heat. So this is betaine, B-E-T-A-I-N-E, sometimes known as TMG, trimethylglycine. And what they were looking at with that is cycling in the heat. Does betaine, is it beneficial for that? The short answer is maybe. The data they had was not super compelling, but they used a pretty high dose. I was able to figure out what the dose was. It is 100 milligrams per kg, and it was twice per day. There is some other data they quoted that it may increase plasma volume. May work on the heat shock protein 70 or HSP 70 pathway. But the data they had said, didn't really show any effect. But again, it was a smaller early study. Something that I thought was a very neat and novel use that we may see more data in the future. So keep an eye out for betaine or TMG, especially if you have endurance athletes in the heat. I'm also going to try it with athletes who are going to go to altitude. Anything that I think I can increase potentially their plasma volume should be beneficial. If you want to know more about carbon dioxide, oxygen, I go into way depth on this in the physiologic flexibility certification. I think I've got 5+ hours on oxygen, carbon dioxide, breathing. We talked a lot about altitude effects, what you can do, breath holds, all that kind of stuff. So look at physiologicflexibility.com. Next was Alyssa Olnick. She was looking at high-intensity interval training related to metabolic flexibility. So one of my favorite topics, of course. And they were using HIIT, so high-intensity interval training, as a way to look at metabolic flexibility, so switching of fuel sources. And then they also did this comparing them with a high-fat meal challenge. And in short, what they saw was if you had a lower fitness status, this was correlated with a lower amount of fat use. Now, again, I know I just dramatically overly simplified an entire study in like 3 years or 4 years of her life's work, but that does kind of match other data that we've seen of VO2 max being associated to fat use. So if you have a very low VO2 max, odds are your ability to use fat is also going to be lower. So doing some work to build up the size of your aerobic engine is going to be beneficial. We also had a talk from Haley Mayer. She's one of Dr. Lonnie Lowry's students. Does coffee consumption acutely hamper heart rate variability in habituated university students? What they saw was, I hinted at this at the beginning, that acute heart rate variability actually increased after consumption of via coffee. So Via is the instant Starbucks brand. The reason they use that is because the caffeine amount in it is actually quite similar. Caffeine amounts in most coffees that are brewed, as a study from a Custer that showed caffeine is variable by quite a bit, even when they tried to standardize it from the same Starbucks, the same type of coffee, just gotten on different days. So it appears, and again, this is based off of some testing they did, which is unpublished yet, Via coffee is much more stable with caffeine. As we know that caffeine can change heart rate, can change heart rate variability. I did a study looking at the effects of this on energy drinks using Monster Energy drink. In this case, they also did use a decaf coffee too. What they found was acute HRV does increase after Via coffee consumption. So a higher heart rate variability is a higher parasympathetic tone. In this case, heart rate was not significantly different. Now, this may be related to the dose used. It may be that they were habituated coffee drinkers. Not really sure, to be honest, yet. But that was kind of not the response I would have guessed. But the confusing part about coffee, too, is that you're going to have a lot of neuronal associations with coffee. Some people drink coffee as a more relaxing type thing. My guess is you're going to see more parasympathetic response there versus someone who uses it to get, jacked up before going to the gym. You're going to see different associations there. They did a longer time course on this one. So timing probably not a significant factor, but that can definitely be a different factor. And it also depends on the dose of caffeine. At some point, if you get up to a very high dose of caffeine, that's probably going to be your overriding effect. And at lower doses, especially in habitual coffee drinkers, maybe not quite so much. And one of the last talks was really interesting. Collagen peptides improve measures of physical function and pain in middle-aged active adults. This was Shavola Kadzowski. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. They looked at collagen peptides. This was a company called Solugel, and it was 86 people, double-blinded, randomized groups. And it was a very small dose that they used. I believe it was around 10 grams, which was split, I think, into 2 5-gram doses. And they did show a difference upon pain and other markers. I was kind of surprised by that. She was very nice. I got to talk to her for quite a while afterwards. And they're in the process now of looking at a lot of the different potential biomarkers going on. Maybe it's kind of triggering some other cellular events or growth factors because the dosing is quite small. This was in addition to their normal diet. It was a split dose, was not necessarily timed before exercise at all. So really fascinating stuff. I think we'll find more and more emerging data on collagen related to soft tissue and even potentially pain. So I look forward to what they find. She said they do have a ton of data that they're in the process now of going through. But it was a pretty big study, pretty robust response. Again, she said I think it took her almost 2.5, 3 years just to get some of the data collected. So it's easy when I get to sit at these conferences and ask researchers all sorts of crazy questions that the amount of time and data collection and everything that goes into, something that gets, whittled down to presented in like 20 or 30 minutes is pretty crazy. So big thanks to all the researchers for all the work that they did coming to the event, presenting it. There was lots of other really great talks too. Wasn't necessarily trying to skip over all of them, but just due to the interest of time, I thought this would be a good rundown. Another quick shout out too was Dr. Chad Kirksig did a great talk on plant-based proteins. Plant-based proteins are kind of all the rage right now. Most of the data would say that if you get a high enough dose with the correct amount of amino acids, you're probably still going to see a good, robust response from that. If you start getting into smaller doses, your whey protein and some of your animal proteins are still going to be better. So this is something that if I work with someone who is more on the plant protein side or even vegan, my first question is, are you able to use a protein supplement at a higher dose? So one of my favorites is just a rice protein at around at least 40-gram dose. There's some interesting data showing that is acutely comparable to whey protein, and there's a couple longer-term studies on that. But I think we'll see more kind of intelligently formulated plant proteins. You can do some very interesting mixing of different types of proteins to complement each other too. So that was good. I always had some great hallway chats with people about this research. The poster sessions were really good. Some very interesting data there. One of them was on, I think it was potentially the use of SARMs at a high dose. They did show some effect, but they also saw some side effects with that, which is interesting. And yeah, so if you can attend the meeting next year and it's something you're into, I would highly recommend it. So hopefully you've enjoyed this brief rundown of the International Society of Sports Nutrition meeting. If you enjoyed it, leave some comments below, whichever you're on, podcast, iTunes, whatever. And yeah, give us a rating. Whatever you think is appropriate is all good, because that helps us get more guests on the show and helps get actual scientific information based on data into the hands of more people. So thank you so much. Really appreciate it. If you enjoyed this, definitely check out the Flex Diet certification. I've got technical sections in there where we break down interventions from protein, carbohydrates, fasting, micronutrition, sleep, and much more. And then I've also got interviews with people in the research and the practical field also. We've got everything from Dr. Dan Party to Dr. Eric Helms, Dr. Stu Phillips, Dr. Jose Antonio himself, and many more. So go to flexdiet.com, FLEXDIET.com. Get on the wait list for the next time that it opens. That'll also put you on the daily newsletter list. Thank you so much. Greatly appreciate it. Talk to you all next week.